Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor David Boonin, and we're going to talk about posthumous harm. All right, Professor, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is David Boonin. I teach philosophy at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And my primary area of research and teaching is applied ethics, sort of broadly construed. So I tend to look for arguments that are, I think, interesting or puzzling or surprising at a theoretical level, but that have some kind of concrete implications for some sort of ethical question that people have in practice. That's me. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
All right. So when you mean posthumous harm, like you mean being able to harm somebody after they have died, correct? That's what you mean.
Well, yeah. So it's actually a good question to start with, because saying that it's possible to harm someone after they die is potentially ambiguous. So it might mean the act happens after the person is dead and it harms them, or it might mean the person sort of like receives the harm, after they're dead. So the thesis that I try to defend in the book, which I call the posthumous harm thesis, let me put it this way. It's possible for an act to harm a person, even if the act takes place after the person is dead. Maybe just a couple of quick clarifications there. When I say dead, I mean dead in like a really robust way. So death is, I assume for the sake of the book anyhow, the permanent annihilation of the person. You don't exist anymore physically, psychologically, spiritually, whatever. Obviously, some people think you can survive your death in a certain way. If you think some people are going to go to hell after they die, then obviously it's not going to be surprising that you think they can be harmed after they die, because they're going to still exist, So when I say it's possible for an act to harm someone, even if that takes place after they're dead, I mean after they have, completely ceased to exist. And when I say it's possible for an act to harm them, I'm trying not to mean anything particularly non-standard by harm. So like make things worse for them, make their life go less well for them, something like that. And that last point I think is important, because for my purposes, I'm interested in the subject because it does have implications for issues in applied ethics. So if an act harms someone, at least prima facie, that's a moral reason not to do it. And so you might think, well, once someone's dead, then it's no longer possible that any of the things you do can, be bad for them. But if the posthumous harm thesis is true, then there's a variety of things that might turn out to be wrong, or at least prima facie wrong, that otherwise, maybe wouldn't be.
Okay. All right. This is an interesting claim, and I think it's a little bit counterintuitive for me. And the reason is because I'm thinking that a person has to exist in order for them to be harmed. Related to that, does it matter how long ago they died? Like, can I harm Genghis Khan, versus somebody who just died yesterday?
Right. Yeah, the second question might be a little hard to talk about without first saying something about the argument. But with respect to the first question, right, is it possible for an act to harm someone if they don't exist? Again, I think I would want to draw a distinction between the act, the act taking place at a time that they don't exist, and harm occurring for a person. So I don't want to give this as an analogy because it's an imperfect analogy, but as an example, I think it's pretty uncontroversial that an act can harm a person if the act takes place before the person exists. So for example, if 30 years before a child is born, I bury a time-sensitive bomb, under the house that the child is going to live in, 30 years later, and it's set to go off in 31 years or whatever, my act harms that child, but the child doesn't exist at the time that I do the act that harms them. So if the source of skepticism is the thought that a person has to exist at the time that the act occurs in order for it to be possible for the act to harm them, then acts that occur before a person exists, those would be a counterexample to that claim. Now, again, that certainly doesn't prove that posthumous harm is also possible. If it did, there wouldn't be that much to talk about.
Okay. So you're making a distinction between an act that harms an individual and the harm that the individual experiences. And those two things do not happen at the same time. Like the act that harms an individual can happen before the harm is actually experienced by the individual.
Right. And so that much, I think, right. So that part, I think, is sort of largely uncontroversial. I think the time delay bomb case is pretty uncontroversial. Right. It's certainly more controversial to say that of posthumous harm. But yes, that's right. does depend on this distinction. But again, like the distinction itself should be relatively uncontroversial, that, and that can take place at one point, and the harm it causes to a person can take place at another point, and the act doesn't necessarily have to happen at a time when the person exists. So that much I think should be relatively uncontroversial. Again, I think the question is going to be, is there a good argument to show that you can also get it to work in the other direction?
How would we harm Genghis Khan?
Yeah, I think like one of the main sources of skepticism about the possibility of posthumous harm, right, is the sort of idea that like, well, when you're dead, like nothing's going to affect you. You won't know what's going on, right? So, if your corpse is desecrated in some horrible way after you're dead, like what's it to you? You won't be there. You won't know what's happening and so forth. And so the main argument that I try to defend in the book is kind of designed to sort of respond maybe more to sort of that source of skepticism. But there's basically 3 steps to it. So I'll say a little bit about each of the steps. And then, when I'm done, why don't I'll come back and try to apply the Genghis Khan case to it. So the first step tries to convince you that it's not implausible to think that you can harm a living person by doing something that doesn't have any effect. They don't know about it, doesn't impinge on their conscious states, and so on and so forth. And that's partly supposed to diffuse the force of the thought that, well, you can't harm a dead person because they're not going to know, what's going on. So kind of cases where something is bad is going on behind a person's back. Those are kind of the best sorts of cases to motivate, I think, the first step of the argument. So I've got this case, Bob, he's married. It's very important to him that he be in a monogamous relationship with his partner. And what he really wants is not just to enjoy the feeling of believing that he's in a monogamous relationship, but it's important to him to actually sort of, be in a monogamous relationship. And he thinks he is, but behind his back, Bob's partner is cheating on him. Or another sort of example, maybe Bob's a teenager, very important to him that he be liked by his peers. He thinks he's got lots of friends. They act nicely to him, in front of his face. But what he doesn't know is that these are all people that his parents are paying to be nice to him. And actually behind his back, they're always talking about how much they dislike him and, making fun of him and so forth. So anyhow, when you give these stories about bad stuff going on behind someone's back, I think it's pretty natural for many people anyhow, to have a reaction that's sort of like, poor Bob, like I feel bad for that guy, or, his life isn't going as well as he thinks it's going, something like that. And if you have a reaction along those lines, then I think what you're sort of thinking is, something bad is happening to Bob, right? If his life isn't going as well as he thinks it's going, something's making his life go worse, than it would otherwise be going. And so then I think that's evidence that you accept the claim that Bob is being harmed, despite the fact that the acts that are harming Bob, again, they go on without him being aware of what's okay. So that's kind of step one of the argument. Step 2 then says, well, assume for the moment anyhow that you accept step 1, that, harm can actually take place in these sort of behind the back cases. Step 2 then says, well, like what's the best explanation of that? Like in virtue of what is it the case that these acts are harming Bob? Now, in some cases, if I punch you in the nose or I kick you in the shin, there's no real mystery about like, how is that harming you? Like it's making you experience unpleasant conscious sensations. That's one way to harm someone, right? Obviously, that can't be the explanation in these behind the back cases, because kind of by stipulation, the stuff that's going on behind their back isn't actually, they're not aware of it. It's not impinging on their conscious sensations and so forth. So the second step, I guess to oversimplify a bit here, not to get too deep into the weeds right now, says, look, like if you agree that Bob's being harmed in those cases, like it's got to be because, he's got a desire that things go a certain way, and these acts are preventing things from going that way, right? And so, he wants to be in a monogamous relationship, but the acts prevent that from being the case. He wants to have genuine friendships, but the acts prevent that from being the case. He doesn't know any of that. He's not aware of that. But that's why it's harming him. So in the book, I call that the desire-satisfaction principle. So one way you can harm someone is by frustrating their desires, even if they're not aware, right, that their desires are being frustrated. So I think, like, if you have those intuitions about the cases like Bob, that's kind of the best explanation. And I guess I also think it's kind of an independently plausible thought that, like, part of what makes a person's life go well for them is their life going the way, that they want it to go. And then finally, and then I will try to get to the Genghis Khan question in just a moment, you take the principle and you apply it to the case of people who are no longer alive. And so step 3 starts with the thought that most people, I think probably all people, we don't just have desires about how things are going right now. We have desires about how things will go in the future. So I have 2 children. I hope they're doing well right now. That's like a present-oriented desire. But, even right now, I hope that they're doing well next month. That would be a future-oriented desire. And most people, I think if you push them, pretty much everybody, let me start this sentence again. I think virtually no one is actually completely indifferent to what happens after they die. I think most people, if you push them in one way or another, like there are certain things that they would prefer that this happen rather than that happen after they die. So suppose Bob is dead, and let's just say in the Bob case, it was important to Bob that his ashes be scattered near the top of his favorite mountain after he died. And then after he died, the person in charge just thinks it's easier to just like flush them down the toilet. So they flush them down the toilet. Well, the act of flushing Bob's ashes down the toilet frustrates this desire that Bob had, right? And that was a desire of Bob's, right? So during Bob's life, he had this future-oriented desire. That act makes it the case that this future-oriented desire that he had it turns out to be a frustrated desire rather than a satisfied desire. So his life as a whole ends up going less well than it otherwise would have gone. And so it harms him. And if I'm right that, at least prima facie harming someone is, prima facie wrong, then there's at least some moral reason not to do that, generated by the fact that doing it would make Bob's life go worse. Now, in the Genghis Khan case, right, it would really depend on what sort of desires, if any, Genghis Khan had about how, for example, he would be remembered, many years later. So some people might be quite indifferent to that, in which case there might be little, if anything, we could do now to harm him. But suppose, for example, that his reputation in history was very important to him, okay? And let's suppose largely what motivated him was the desire to be remembered positively in the future, okay? And let's suppose that, in fact, the way he did that was to engage in peaceful acts of collaboration with neighboring peoples and so forth, and that in reality, like, he never hurt anyone, he was very nice to everyone, he helped bring peace, to the world and so forth. But then at some subsequent point in history, historians made up these lies about him as this conqueror who was like vicious and violent and so forth. And so now today, as a result of what those historians did by lying about Genghis, many of us have these false beliefs about Genghis, and largely what motivated him during his life, was to do peaceful acts of cooperation that would lead him to later be remembered as a beloved, peaceful, person and so forth. So in that sort of case, and on the kind of account that I defend in the book, what's happened to Genghis after he died makes his life have gone much worse for him. Maybe one last thing I'll say, looks like you might already be ready to ask some more questions, is, another way you can sort of think of it is in terms of the notion of like a project. So, suppose during his life, like, he thought like a big project of mine is to bring peace to the world in a way that will make me a beloved figure, in history. And suppose, during his life, like he actually did bring, peace to people and so forth. But like, again, for him, the big project was to be remembered as this peace-loving person. If the historians then insert all these lies about him so that we all remember him as this horrible monster or something, then what that means is during his life, he was unsuccessfully pursuing the project of building a beloved posthumous reputation rather than successfully building that posthumous reputation. And then I'd want to say, like an unsuccessful life is a less good life.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to go the desire-satisfactionist route. It was one of the top options that came to mind when trying to argue for like something like posthumous harm, Yeah, I these discussions, I feel like it's so hard not to rely on my intuitions, because even the examples that you cite earlier about a person who thinks he's in a monogamous marriage, but, the wife is actually cheating on him, it's a part of me thinks that his well-being is worse, but part of me thinks it's not. And I think it's because there is some part of me that thinks that you have to change, like you have to experience this sort of harm. Like it actually has to change the way that your life goes for you. And if something happens and you're totally unaware of it, then that doesn't actually change your experiences, right? So I know like the common criticism against, desire-satisfactionism is what if I desire there to be like super intelligent, technologically advanced aliens somewhere in the universe, and unbeknownst to me, those beings actually exist. And how does that actually benefit me? How does that make my life better?
Right. Yeah. So there's a few different things going on there. So one is, so strictly speaking, the argument doesn't have to depend on the desire-satisfaction principle. Although in my book, that's kind of the main example I give. So for example, if someone holds a view of well-being that's more focused on, something like an objective list sort of view. So they might think that, for example, successfully completing certain kinds of projects makes your life go better, kind of regardless of whether you care about it, or some people, at least in ancient times, maybe would, having children who flourish means your life has gone better, even if you don't, care about your children. So you can make the same basic argument, the same basic three-step argument, if at the first step you give a different explanation of why Bob's life isn't going as well. So having real friends is the part of a good life. He thinks he's got them, but he doesn't. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then I guess maybe two other comments. So one is I notice you said something like, right, so part of you feels the force of the thought that, maybe things are worse for Bob in these cases, but part of you is attracted to the view that, well-being depends on your experiences, kind of like a hedonistic point of view. And you said something like, it has to be something you're experiencing. It has to be something that makes your life go better, for you or worse for you. And I want to just sort of flag that the debate between hedonists, people who think the only thing there is that makes your life go better or worse has to do with like how it affects your conscious states, and non-hedonists, including desire satisfaction theorists and objectivist theorists, all those different theories, they can all agree that an act only harms you if it makes your life go worse for you. Okay, to some extent, that's like the necessary locution if we're having a discussion about well-being. But what a defender of like the desire satisfaction view or the objective list view or any kind of hybrid view is going to say is that we have to be very careful not to let the hedonist beg the question and say that what we mean by right going better for you, we just mean going better like to you, like as far as you can see or something. Because then anyone who holds any other theory of well-being is just going to say no, that it's not fair to define well-being that way. So so I just want to be clear. I agree, and I think it's essentially true by definition. Like an act isn't going to harm Bob if it doesn't make things worse for him, okay? But the question is, right, are there cases where, things are making his life go worse for him, he's just not aware of it, right? And I guess the last thing I'll say is, the reaction you described of kind of, ambivalence, that's an extremely common reaction. Like I think virtually no one, unless they're already like totally sold on a particular theory, I think virtually no one looks at a case like that and thinks there's like an obvious answer, right? You feel this kind of pull in a couple of different directions. And so part of what I do in the chapter, there's sort of one chapter on each of the three steps of the argument and then a chapter on some implications is, like I look at different attempts that people give to sort of debunk that intuition. I do feel sorry for Bob, but I think maybe that's not justified. Well, why is that? Well, because maybe this is going on or that's going on or this other thing is going on. In each case, I try to look at what the debunker says and try to sort of work around and show, look, but there's still, there's a version of the case where that's not going to handle or whatever. So in the end, I'm still inclined to think that, Bob's life goes worse in some of these cases, worse for him, that the acts are wrong in part because they are making things worse for him. But definitely, if someone is unconvinced by that, and in particular, if they're sold on a hedonic version of well-being on which the only way you can make a person's life go less well for them is to cause, let's say, pain or discomfort or distress or something like that, then it's pretty simple to show that posthumous harm isn't possible.
Yeah, I have to do more thinking about this because I am an objective list theorist, but at the same time, I think the items on the list have an experience component to it, right? So for like me, I'm okay with like the common items on the list. I'm okay with pleasure being on the list. I'm okay with knowledge, achievement, and loving relationships. So now I'm wondering if you could possess, like if knowledge has an experience component to it.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, so compare two lives of people who they devote their lives to trying to solve a long-standing problem in mathematics or pure physics or something like that. By the end of their career, they've each settled on a solution or whatever. They believe that they've got the right answer, and it makes each of them feel sort of equally good, about themselves. And let's say in one case, they got it right. In the other case, there's a mistake they just never, discovered. So right. So if you're like an either if you're an objective list theorist or you're a hybrid theorist, so you think like, desire satisfaction is part of the story, pleasure is part of the story, but, part of the story is, objective list. Then yeah, at least on the face of it, I'd be inclined to think you got to say, the person who actually got it right, their life went better than the person who thought they got it right, even though experientially they were each, sort of having the same positive feelings of, thinking that they had sort of solved this problem. So I think in that sense, it shouldn't be so hard to think that there would be a non-experiential component to well-being. And then as far as how this might apply to the posthumous harm case, right, so maybe it would be something like they were each at work during their life on solving a problem that would make it possible to build, the world's longest suspension bridge or something like this. And they knew while they were working on it that the bridge would never be completed in their lifetime, but they're doing all the theoretical work to try to make it possible. And then they each produce a design and they die, feeling very good about their belief that this bridge will be built, successfully. And then, each of the bridges get built and one of them, exactly to specification, right? And one of them lasts, for thousands of years, the other one collapses in a week because there was this flaw in the design that nobody noticed or whatever. Right. So the posthumous harm thesis is going to say, sorry, let's give them names. Al and Bill. Well, actually, let's have gender neutral names. Dana and Kit. So Dana and Kit, did this. Dana's bridge is still standing. Kit's bridge fell apart, 10 minutes after it went up or whatever. So the argument is going to say that these things that happened or didn't happen after Dana and Kit died are relevant to how successfully Dana and Kit were devoting their lives to these theoretical, enterprises. And so it turns out, as a result of what happened later, that Dana's life was much more successful than Kit's. And that seems to me, I'm glad you asked this question and mentioned the objective list thing, because to me, that seems like the right result. And that seems like a result that the objective list theorist should agree, sort of follows from their view. And part of what I like about it is that part by itself doesn't depend on accepting anything to do with the desire satisfaction principle, right? So, on the objective list, just like, look, I mean, suppose neither of them really liked their job, they really were just doing it to like make money to feed their families or whatever. Still, like one of them spent their life successfully doing something and the other spent their life unsuccessfully doing something. And the something that they were trying to do, regardless of whether maybe they don't care about bridges, right? But nonetheless, it's objectively valuable, right? So then, I think the objectivist theorist should say that as a result of events that occurred after their deaths, one's life was much better than the others. And then, right, on the account, the kind of account I use in the book, I would have probably been saying something like, they devote their lives to designing these bridges because they care so much about them. And then the desire satisfaction account would get you the same.
I don't know if there has to be, like, I guess this temporal element to it, right? Because I get normally when we think of achievements, we think of things that we achieve during our lifetimes, right? And so then now we have to factor in the fact that a person has died and the project is, gets completed maybe 5 years later, right?
Yeah.
Would that still be an achievement for that person?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that. So I'm inclined to think, so you use the word normally. I guess I'm not sure that's, I guess I'm not quite sure what the significance of that is. So if a person has 10,000 goals over the course of their life, I think there's, some of those goals are going to be goals that for them have a kind of like a termination date, before they die. I think that's right. But I think there are going to be others, like anyone who has children. I shouldn't say anyone. I think most people who have children, like their goal is not just, I want to have kids that seem happy to me as long as I'm still alive, because what a drag it would be to have like unhappy children. Like, part of their important goal in parenting the children is raising them so that they can be flourishing, successful people even after the parents are dead. Okay. So, in that sense, it's normal, for parents to view child raising as a project of theirs that whose success doesn't have a deadline that ends, when they, the parents die. Artists, creators, that's another kind of example. So in the opening chapter to my book, I use what I admit is kind of an extreme case, but I guess I want to suggest, it's an extreme version of something that, as a general matter, I don't think is so uncommon. So this is the case of Clyfford Still, who was an early abstract expressionist artist, and in the early stages of his career, he was very bothered by the fact that successful artists, their work often got bought up by collectors and kind of like scattered all over the world. And to him, at least, it was important that this work he was creating would be preserved primarily in one central location, so that after he was dead, people could come and visit and see like more or less the totality of his work. Now that's kind of an extreme case. So like he had these very idiosyncratic views. He wanted there to be a museum that only showed his work, wasn't supposed to have a cafeteria, I don't know, kind of maybe some eccentric desires. So that makes it sort of extreme. On the other hand, of all the artists you can think of, how many of them do you think there are who are completely indifferent to what happens to their art after they die? Who they're like, well, after I die, I could care less if like it all burns up or whatever. And again, there might be some extreme cases, or there have been some cases where someone wants them to be destroyed, after they're dead. But again, that's caring, right, about what happens. So, yeah, I mean, there's lots of everyday projects, achievements, and so forth where, whatever, I'm teaching a class, I want the class to go well. The class ends in December, that's sort of it. But again, I think for most people, there are at least some things that they care about, that they commit themselves to, where they're not indifferent to how things go after they die, and how things go after they die can have an effect on the success or not of the achievement.
Yeah, I definitely do think that people have desires that are aimed at something that happens after they personally die. That makes perfect sense, and I think that makes sense for any parent. So my next question is about, I guess, another timing problem, right? Which is, when does that negative event harm the person? If the person has already died, I'm assuming that they don't exist. We're assuming that there's no afterlife. And
right.
So in my mind, if a person doesn't exist, they don't have a state of well-being.
Right.
So then are they being harmed in this state of non-existence?
No, yeah. So now we're kind of back to the question, one of the questions that we started with. So if I plant the time bomb underneath the house of the child who won't be conceived for 30 years, right, they don't have any well-being, or it's incoherent to talk about them having well-being, at the time I do the act. Right. So, but the act nonetheless harms them because their life is, let's assume it ends up maiming them, because of my act, their life ends up going worse than it otherwise would have gone. It goes worse while they're alive. But the act takes place before. So, so the answer is going to be basically the same. So maybe I'll stick with the Clyfford Still case for a moment. So in fact, what ended up happening with the real Clyfford Still is he did successfully keep the vast majority of his work intact. And after he died, maybe 20 years after he died, a museum eventually did open that met all the criteria that he had set out. But now you picture a hypothetical version of the story where, while he's alive, every time he finishes a painting, somebody steals the painting and replaces it with a duplicate, and then his actual art gets scattered all over the world. But he gets fooled by these forgeries, and so at the end of his career, he arranges to have all the forgeries displayed in some museum. So in a case like that, right, the idea again would be, I'm sorry. I need to modify the case, because in that case, the harms occurred also while he was alive. Sorry. Okay. Let's say a day after he dies, somebody steals all of his paintings and replaces them with forgeries, and then all the forgeries get displayed at this museum, and people get tricked into thinking, or maybe they're not even forgeries. After he's dead, like he's not around to authenticate them. Maybe they're very inferior, And so now everybody goes to this museum, like, geez, that Clyfford Still, I heard he was an important abstract expressionist, but like this was his stuff. Like this stuff stinks, right? Right. Okay. So in a case like that, right. So the act that the act would take place after he was dead. So after he's dead, all his paintings are stolen and replaced with inferior forgeries. And then everyone's tricked into thinking that those were his paintings or whatever. So the act takes place after he was dead. But the harm sort of, what I say, like accrues to him during his life. It's like during his life, he's trying very hard to make this thing happen. And what he wants is to have something happen after he dies. And then because of these acts that happen after he dies, the desires that he has while he's alive turn out to be unsatisfied or frustrated desires rather than satisfied desires. And since the desires that are frustrated by the subsequent acts are his desires, then his life is the one that ended up containing, fewer satisfied desires or, more frustrated desires or what have you. But again, I do want to sort of emphasize, you could tell the same sort of story without appealing to the desire satisfaction principle if, among other things, you thought that creating important works of art for posterity is an objectively valuable human endeavor or something like that, because then again, you'd say the subsequent act prevented him while he was alive from successfully doing this thing.
Yeah, okay, so then the harm accrued is when the person is alive, right? But, when the person's alive, it hasn't happened yet, and he doesn't know it's going to happen. But after he dies and like maybe some years later, that's when it happens. And then his well-being state kind of almost like, it doesn't change retroactively. That's not what I hear what you're saying. It's almost like his well-being state is in a state of flux. It's unknown, and it can only be determined by a future event after he dies.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some complicated questions here. These are good questions. So I guess let me say a couple things. So one is, it's a little bit difficult because, like, sometimes when I try to give an answer to some of these questions, I think, in fact, there's more than one answer that I could give that's consistent with, my overall position. So the way I was talking, yes, I think I was talking in a way that said, and I guess I find myself more naturally inclined to say this, something like the act took place after he was dead, but he, accrued the harm or incurred the harm, during his life, because it's during his life that he was stuck with this, unsatisfied desire. The view is consistent with a different kind of view that I think some other people have defended, which is that harms can be accrued kind of, atemporally or, sort of outside of time. So like, something happens and it happens at a certain point in time, like, the paintings get stolen at a certain point in time, or the bridge collapses at a certain point in time. But yeah, in some views, that makes it the case that the person's life was less successful. When did it make it the case? No, it's just, it makes it the case, right? So I think, right, so you can either go the route that says the subsequent act means that while he was alive, he was already harmed, or you can take it to mean, sometimes, people just are in a harmed state, but there's not a time at which they sort of incur, the harmed state. But right, you can also take it in the way that I think you were kind of suggesting at the end. So you could hold the view, again, all these views are consistent with the position, right? That, while he's alive, maybe there's no fact of the matter about whether he's being successful. That only gets resolved later. And then it's only later that, it now becomes true that his life went worse. I think there are some kind of problems with that sort of approach, but if that's the right way to go, if anything, it only sort of like reinforces the posthumous harm thesis, right? Because then you're really sort of saying, like, while he was alive, he was like here, and then after he died, now he's down here, right? So yeah, if it helps, I don't know, for anyone who's like listening to the discussion, you can sort of make a rough analogy, at least if you're talking about the desire satisfaction theory approach, between like desires and beliefs. And so if I have a forward look, so I think like the NBA playoffs are starting this weekend, and let's say the Nuggets are playing the Lakers tomorrow at so let's say I think the Lakers are going to win, you think the Nuggets are going to win, or I probably should have said I think the Nuggets are going to win because I'm here in Colorado. But right, so and then so let's say I think the Nuggets are going to win, and then let's say tomorrow the Nuggets do win. Right, so on some view, what we ought to say tomorrow is, oh, David, it turns out you were right. Like yesterday when you said the Nuggets were going to win, right then and there when you said it, you were right. We didn't know you were right, But it turns out you were right. And what made it the case that you were right yesterday, right, is that the Nuggets, in fact, won. So I think that's kind of like a natural way, to think about there, or at least a natural way that many people find, to talk about these things. And if that's what we say in the belief case, then prima facie, that's what we should say in the desire case. So while Clifford was alive, he had this very important to him forward-looking desire. And what happened after he died, in my hypothetical version anyhow, right, means that while he was alive, he was saddled with this big frustrated desire. He didn't know that it was frustrated, but that's what we said about, the Bob cases. On the other hand, right, so you might say, like in the belief case, if I say I think the Nuggets are going to win today, maybe right now I'm neither right nor wrong. Maybe there's no fact of the matter. Maybe my, what kind of epistemic score do I get? It's like nothing or indeterminate or whatever. But then maybe tomorrow, if the Nuggets win, then sort of retroactively now, tomorrow you'll be able to say, well, David wasn't right when he said it, but now it turns out that, what he believed, is true, whatever. And if that's what we said, then again, I think to some extent we'd say, well, at the time, there was no fact of the matter about how well Clifford was doing, but now there's a fact of the matter. And the fact of the matter is he wasn't doing very well because he was trying really hard to make this thing happen that ended up, not happening. Now, as I said before, there's something kind of weird about putting it that way. But if someone thinks that's the more natural way to think about these things, then again, if anything, all the better for the view that I defend in the book, because then you're really saying, like, look, after someone dies, you can really harm them because you can actually go back and change, right, what the state was of their, what their score was, their epistemic score or their well-being score, while they were alive.
Okay, yeah. Because if it does have retroactive effect, then you would think that a person's well-being state, like my current well-being state, unbeknownst to me, it's actually fluctuating right now because of future events that happen after I die, right? So let's say that I have a desire to write philosophy that a lot of people are going to read after I die, okay?
Yeah.
What is a lot? I don't know, right? So let's say, a lot of people, whatever a lot means, a lot of people read stuff after I die. So then I'm like, my well-being state right now is actually pretty good. But then like maybe 100 years later, like people forget my work. And then, okay, so now my well-being state actually isn't very good. And then maybe 100 years later, somebody discovers my work and then a bunch of people start reading it again. So then my well-being, you see what I'm saying? Like at what point does it actually determine my well-being state? If the fact of the matter can change over time.
Yeah. So let me, I'll try to answer the question in the context of the desire satisfaction view. But again, I kind of want to flag that I don't think it depends on the desire satisfaction view. And so there might be it might well be compatible with, other views, including hybrid views and the objective list view. So in the case of the desire satisfaction view, I guess what I would say is this, like, I think we would have to sort of like disambiguate. Okay. So this is going to be artificial, but I think sometimes that's just the way you got to do it, right? So I would say I have a desire that my books still be read in the first 10 years after I die, but I'd also like them to be read, 10 years after that and 10 years after that, So let's just to keep things simple, let's say that's 5 different desires that we've just identified for the first 50 years after I die. And then suppose for the first 20 years, lots of people are reading my books, or let's say, I wanted them to read them and say nice things about them, and so for the first 20 years after my death, they're reading them, they're saying nice things about them. Then for some reason, after 20 years, like, I don't know, something happens, like everybody simultaneously forgets that I ever existed. And this full 10 years goes by and no one reads any of my books or says anything about it. And then someone rediscovers it. And then the next 2 decades after that, lots of discussion or whatever. So then I would say, so I have five different desires, 4 of which are satisfied, 1 of which is not. So that's like pretty good, but it could be better. And I would analogize it roughly to a case where, there's 5 people that I hope are not, while I'm still alive, I hope they're not slandering me behind my back. I hope A isn't doing that. I hope B isn't doing that. C, D, and E, well, if 4 of them are not, and 1 of them is, okay, I'm doing pretty well. 4 of my 5 desires are being satisfied, but it'd be even better if all 5 were, and it'd be worse if, fewer than 4 were. And so I would say the same thing about these changes that can occur over time. With respect to something more like the objective list view, I really think it's going to depend on, what the good is that we're looking at. But, if part of what's objectively good is, creating making a contribution that benefits humanity after you're gone or something like this, then you could tell a similar sort of story. Like, if I create something that benefits people for a while, then it stops benefiting them, and then it benefits them later on. Like, still, that's pretty good. But yeah, my life would have been even better. Would have been even more successful if, to go back to the bridge case, I designed the bridge and it stayed open uninterruptedly for hundreds of years, versus one where like for a 10-year period, they had to fix some problem in it or something. Yeah, my life would be a little bit less successful in that scenario.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about like the harm and well-being component. I kind of want to switch gears and talk about like the moral and moral implications component, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I can harm somebody who's living, and I can also harm somebody who's already dead. Who takes precedence? Is it more wrong for me to harm somebody who's living than somebody else who's dead? Let's say if they have the same desires.
Right. So I want to say, okay. So, well, that last part you added was quite important. So, yeah. So in the last chapter of the book, right, so basically there's like an introduction, and then there's a chapter each for defending each of the three steps of the argument, and then there's a chapter talking about concrete implications. So, right, so I developed a test, and the basic idea is if you accept the posthumous harm thesis, right, what you should think is there is a certain kind of harm such that inflicting it on a living person versus inflicting it on someone after they're dead, that difference is not relevant. But right, it's got to be the kind of harm that's analogous to the sort of behind the back sort of case in the living person case. So here's one kind of example. So I'm interested in the question of whether we do something wrong to someone, and this sort of thing happens quite frequently in like academic history, for example. If after they die, their diaries are published, and at least we have good evidence that they didn't want that to be the case. Okay, so if we want to ask, is it worse to publish someone's diary while they're alive and they don't want it to be published versus publishing it after they're dead when while they were alive they didn't want it to be published after they were dead? You have to do some stipulating that's going to make the case pretty artificial. But if philosophers are typically willing to play along, right? So suppose there is someone who right now I could arrange to publish their diary while they're still alive, but I could also arrange to guarantee that even though millions of people would read their diary and laugh, at their intimate thoughts about sexuality and whatever, I could absolutely guarantee that they'll never find out about this. Okay, but then also, and admittedly, this makes the case, pretty artificial. Like, you also have to guarantee not only will they never find out about this, but like it won't indirectly have any effect on them. So, for example, they won't miss out on some job offer that they otherwise would have gotten that they don't know about or whatever. Okay, but if you manage to fix the cases in that way, yeah, then what I want to say is that the implication of the posthumous harm thesis is this. Under whatever set of detailed circumstances you stipulate for this pair of cases, if you want to know, sorry, no is a little bit too strong. If you want to decide whether it would be wrong to publish this person's diary after they're dead, ask yourself whether you think it would be wrong to publish it while they were alive, as long as you were confident that they would never find out about it and that the people reading it would never even sort of indirectly, affect them. And if your view is, like, all things considered, the benefits to humanity of reading the diary outweigh the harm to this individual so that it would be fine to do it while they're still alive, yeah, then you should say the same thing about, the case after they were dead. So Kafka is a very famous example of this. Lots of people think that, look, I mean, the great benefits to humanity of reading Kafka make it like okay that this happened, even if, at least on a common understanding of the story, he sincerely instructed his friend to burn all the manuscripts upon his death. As long as you think that it would have been fine to do that to Kafka while he was alive, because so many people would benefit from reading the trial, as long as you could guarantee that Kafka never found out about it and wasn't made upset about it, yeah, if you think that, then you should say the same about the posthumous case. But if you think, no, like, you can't publish someone's diary while they're alive just because lots of people enjoy reading it, like, that's not okay. then I think you ought to say the same thing about the publication case. And then I might just add quickly, although maybe just leave it to you or people watching this to sort of fill in the details. But I know you have particular interest in bioethics. I think you can do the same thing with posthumous organ removal, or for that matter, posthumous sperm removal or egg removal, right? So again, you have to make the cases pretty artificial. But suppose it were possible while a person was alive, so we know this person maybe has religious beliefs that they should be buried with their body intact. They don't want to have any organs removed. Suppose you could possibly, without them knowing it, maybe while they're asleep, remove, a piece of liver or one of their kidneys, and you just stipulate it won't have any effect on their health, and they'll never know. But you could use it to really help some other person. If you think that would be okay, then certainly you should say the same thing about the posthumous removal case. But if you think it would be wrong to do that to a living person, if you knew that they didn't want it to happen, even if you could do that without them knowing that it happened, like while they were asleep, and you could guarantee that it would have no effect on their health or their pain states or anything, if you're like, no, you still can't do that if that's not what they want to have done with their body, then prima facie, you should say the same thing about the posthumous case.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up those cases. I think for me, the wrong lies in the violation of autonomy and not necessarily harm. Although those two concepts, I think they're separate, but they often overlap. And I'm not entirely sure how to disentangle them, in any particular case. Because let's say this, sperm retrieval, posthumous sperm retrieval, right? That's a case that, big hospitals deal with sometimes. And for me, the question is, well, what did that person want? But when I ask that question, it's not because I think only about their well-being. It's not because I only care about that if we respect their wishes, then their well-being would be higher or at least not lowered. It's because I just think it matters that this person has certain desires about their own body, and I think it's important for other people to respect that. You know what I mean?
Okay. But now notice, if this is cashed out in terms of people have strong desires about their body, like in the kind of case I have in mind, it doesn't have to be a religious case, but sometimes these are useful, right? They have a very strong desire that their body be buried intact, right? That's their body. So if I want to go a little further, I might have a desire. Maybe it's important to me that your body be buried intact. Oh, yeah, that might be true. Okay. But the autonomy thing comes in with but I have a desire about my body being buried intact. And so, if you're thinking in the living person case, no, really, it's not just about well-being, it's about autonomy, and autonomy has to do with, respecting the person's desire about how their body is treated. Again, I want to say prima facie, we ought to say the same thing about the posthumous case.
Yeah, I think that all the examples that you brought up about posthumous harm, I think I would just understand that as a wrong, but as a wrong in terms of autonomy instead of well-being. Because I think I'm not willing to let go of the experiential component.
Right, yeah. So, I guess I'll make a couple of comments. So one is, and I think I said this earlier, so if someone is committed to a hedonic view of well-being, on which the only way that an act can make things worse for a person is to affect the quality of their conscious sensations, then absolutely I agree the posthumous harm thesis can't get off the ground. So I want to sort of reiterate that. So I don't have any problem if someone says, because I'm committed to a purely hedonic account of well-being, I reject the thesis. That just sounds like the right thing to do. But I do want to also emphasize, that sorry, this might be a bit repetitive, but, the desire satisfaction theory is particularly a theory that I find myself naturally coming back to. But, a hybrid theorist who thinks that, pain is bad for people, desire frustration is bad for people, certain objective list things are bad for people, they can all get on board. And, to the extent that someone's got these more objective list sort of intuitions as well, as I said earlier, I think the argument can still go through.
So as a thought experiment, let's imagine that there's some sort of creature that can have desires, but actually can't have any experiences. So then on an account that is based or grounded in desire-satisfactionism, that creature can be harmed, right?
I'm inclined to say yes. So I'm inclined to say, for example, obviously a fair amount's going to depend on what we mean by desires of this.
Yes.
But I think, a plausible example might be a tree or a plant So it might be plausible. For the first one, I assume it's pretty plausible to say it's not having any conscious experiences. But it might also be plausible to say, if it makes sense to refer to desires in an entity that doesn't have conscious experiences, why is it growing this way rather than that way? Why is it moving? Because it's naturally prone to desire to face the sun, or to grow its roots deep, or something like this. Then I think frustrating its desires, at least prima facie, would make things worse for it. That sounds right. So if you had two identical plants, neither of which had conscious sensation, but had desires, again, to the extent that we understand the term desire to still, refer to develop in a certain way, then one would be doing better than the other if it was growing in the way that it sort of naturally. I'm sorry, I find myself keep using these quotation marks, desires to grow or something like that. I think that sounds right. And then I do think there would be a legitimate question about whether we think. So suppose I said, so you can harm a tree, not just damage. Like you can damage a coffee mug. Like if you break the mug, you've damaged the mug. That's bad for you, but that's not bad for the mug. But if I'm understanding your question, I think it could be plausible to say, you're not just damaging the tree, you're harming the tree. I think there would then be this further question: does the fact that the tree isn't conscious, even if we agree that you've harmed it, does the fact that it's not conscious mean that the harm to the tree is like morally irrelevant or something like that? And I don't have deep thoughts about this, but I guess I'm at least skeptical of the thought that it would then be completely irrelevant. Why would that be completely irrelevant? We might still say, well, it's a lot less bad to harm a tree than to harm a person, because or to frustrate the desires of a tree than to frustrate the desires of a person, because persons are conscious and trees aren't, and so forth. I would find that pretty plausible. But notice, I guess this is the part I'd want to emphasize, from the point of view of the posthumous harm thesis, that's fine, because, when Clifford still was alive, he was conscious, right? And so even if it's the case that the harm that the subsequent events caused to him is only of the desire satisfaction kind, again, that's equally true of, publishing someone's diary while they're alive or whatever. You're not causing any harm to them, sort of consciously. If you're doing something wrong, if you're making things worse for them, it's with respect to the desires. And so, maybe the fact that a being that has desires is a conscious being means, or frankly, people might say, is not just conscious, but he's, a rationally autonomous being or something. If it's a conscious, rationally autonomous being, then really, morally speaking, it's very bad to disrespect its desires. Then again, that's all going to be fine as far as the posthumous harm thesis goes, because Clifford still was a conscious, rationally autonomous human being, and things that might have been done after his death, at least in my hypothetical version of the story, would have made things much worse for him while he was alive. He would have been basically wasting his entire artistic career, because he was doing it all with this goal of leaving something for posterity.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.